English translation, 716th Contact, Part 2. Friday the 8th of March 2019, 1842 hours.
Allegedly pertinent to the topic of climate change are also the following strange references to an article supposedly related to the matter.
SRG survey. Restrictions, yes, as long as they do not hurt according to the SRG survey, 80% of the Swiss would be willing to spend more on local and seasonal products. In other words, to change their eating habits. B. Buying local, seasonal, or organic products does not require any real sacrifice, and the consumer even benefits. These products are perceived as healthier and of higher quality. When I buy organic, I even do something good for my body. That catches on. C. So eat organic but fly to Ibiza? D. A classic behavior. The key word here is moral justification. Because I've behaved in an environmentally friendly way, I believe I've bought the moral justification to be a little more lax in another area. This can have absurd consequences. For example, someone who buys an energy-efficient car may have the tendency to suddenly take the car also for shorter distances that he or she otherwise traveled by bicycle or on foot. In the worst case, energy consumption may even increase. F. Various neurologists see the problem in our Stone Age brain. We are simply not capable of reacting to an abstract danger like climate change. What happens in 2050 or 100 years is too far away. What is your opinion? Answer from an unknown person: I agree. Climate change is gradual. There is no change from one day to the next. The influences are delayed. That might make it difficult to react to it. If I behave in an exemplary way and do without a flight, there are no visible consequences. All human beings can be motivated, some by financial incentives, others by prestige. So we have Stone Age brains, immovable habits, and confusing energy labels that make climate-conscious behavior difficult. Please give us a little hope. There is. Those who are not environmentally conscious will not simply become so. But our studies have shown that there are starting points for every human being. Some people are motivated by financial incentives, others by political ones. Still others react to their social environment and want to be perceived as particularly environmentally friendly. Solar panels on the roof are a good example. They are now seen as a statement that one is environmentally friendly and innovative. According to a Dutch study, this prestige is even the most important reason for installing solar panels. Supposedly in keeping with the theme of climate change, there are also the following strange references to a related article: Climate Change Chat with the Federal Government and SBB, and Climate Change Chat with Science and Research. A. In many countries, so-called nudging is popular. Consumers are to be gently nudged, and thus motivated to change their behavior. Also in Switzerland? B. This is a very effective method that is generally accepted by consumers. In Switzerland, for example, it has led to many human beings switching to green electricity. In 2006, the electricity company of the city of Zurich switched the standard electricity product, which is automatically assigned to every household, from nuclear energy to green electricity. A. It is best to start where lifestyle and comfort are least restricted. Customers were informed and could take on a return letter if they did not want the new standard green electricity. About 15% did so and actively chose nuclear power again, most because they did not want to be forced to buy a green product. B. A good 80%, however, silently accepted the new standard green electricity product, even though it was about 0.5 centimes more expensive per kilowatt hour. Many of these customers would not have switched without this gentle nudge. A. So most of us need a little pressure from outside. But are there also tips on how we can motivate ourselves? B. The easiest way is to start where there are the least restrictions on lifestyle and comfort. So, for example, buy energy-efficient light bulbs or appliances. Here in particular, you can make a big difference with little effort. Or avoid imported products and buy organic. And now in winter you could simply turn down the heating a little. A. The good thing is that we human beings have a need for consistency in our behavior. So once you start, it often motivates you to behave in a climate-friendly way in other areas as well. Energy-saving tips from the FOIA Federal Office for the Environment. 1. Choose green electricity instead of the standard offer. 2. LED lamps instead of incandescent bulbs. 3. Dry laundry on the line instead of in the tumble dryer. 4. Drink tap water instead of buying bottled water. 5. Buy seasonal vegetables instead of those from the greenhouse. 6. Eat pulses instead of meat. 7. Take the train instead of the plane. 8. Holiday locally or in Europe instead of traveling far away. 9. Take the train to work instead of the car. 10. Carpooling instead of sitting alone in the car. 11. Drive an electric car instead of a petrol car.
If I now let all these statements run through my mind and try to find the meaning behind them, I realize that the whole of the statements amounts to nothing but stupid, silly and pointless gibberish, which is probably meant to be given a nimbus of the climate problem by mentioning the term climate. But if everything is really analyzed, then in all statements and explanations only ignorance, lack of understanding, grandiloquence, stupidity, lack of understanding, irrelevance and a desire to make oneself big can be seen behind everything. The proposals that are made correspond to pure ill-considered, useless fantasies that are as worthless as a rotten tomato, because they do not address reality and its truth in any way, and consequently, no real and tangible solutions are put forward with the ill-considered statements and sham proposals. And this is also the case with the FOIA, which proves that at this environmental agency, too, absolutely illogical thoughts prevail and are exploited, because the problems are not considered logically, but only ill-considered conclusions are drawn because the effective factors of the whole shebang are neither recognized nor understood. And that this is the case is proven by the FOIA with its 11 ill-considered energy-saving tips, because they evaporate immediately before they can even be implemented. And this should actually be obvious to every human being, even if one's cleverness and cunning as well as intellect, reason and intelligence have not exactly been fed with shovel excavators. But obviously also those are not smart and clever enough to grasp effective reality and its truth who consider themselves to be shovel feeders with regard to understanding, reason, intelligence, and logic. Hence the question, how else would the 11 energy-saving tips from the FOIA come about, which are nothing more and nothing less than ridiculous? If these FOIA tips are carefully considered and analyzed, it becomes clear that the thinking is completely illogical, and that the effective facts have neither been recognized nor considered. Effectively, these proposals are full of ill-considered stupid speeches and of mindless, senseless and intelligent stupid proposals, which have no relevance or any particular significance and importance with regard to a containment of climate change or climate destruction. These stupid proposals clearly prove the absolute incompetence and ignorance of the authors of the proposals, who are incapable of recognizing the effective reality of the real origin of climate destruction due to their lack of knowledge and perception of reality and its truth. The majority of those responsible for the world in governments, science, environmental and climate protection, etc. suffer from megalomania and delusions of grandeur. They pretend to be knowledgeable and wise, but they understand absolutely nothing and are nevertheless pathological know-it-alls with regard to reality and its truth, or pathological fools and reality and truth suppressors. They either do not recognize these in their stupid stupidity, or if they do recognize them, they are too cowardly to state the effectively recognized facts because they fear for their positions, their horrendous salaries, and their reputation. So, on the one hand, in their stupidity, they do not know the reality and truth of the cause of climate destruction, or on the other hand, for reasons of personal profit, etc., they are too cowardly to openly name the cause of climate destruction, which is based solely on all the destructive machinations of massive overpopulation. Only the degenerated destructive machinations of every kind and kind, which arise from the ground up from the massive human overpopulation. Demolish, batter, ruin, devastate, smash and destroy slowly, and with absolute certainty the planet Earth, as well as its nature and its fauna and flora. And the more Earth humans multiply, the worse, more destructive and more destructive all the degenerate machinations become, through which the entire existence of the Earth, its nature, fauna, and flora, the atmosphere and the climate, and even humanity itself, is endangered and driven towards a bad end. In this context, all the idiotic and ill-considered measures, regulations and bans aimed at reducing or completely eliminating the plastic household are of no use, just as any restriction of CO2 emissions brings no benefit and no recovery for a stabilization of the climate, just as any other measures that are idiotically and uselessly fantasized for climate protection and for the containment of climate change or climate destruction are of no use. And all this nonsense is already useless when it is even conceived in thoughts and ideas, because at the same time new Earthlings are already being conceived and born en masse, while millions of others are growing up and claiming their rights to indulge in all the degenerate climate-destroying machinations themselves. And this regardless of what these degenerate, destructive machinations are about, whether it is the use of CO2-emitting vehicles, the spreading of chemical toxins into nature, the building of land for houses, factory buildings, factories, roads, sports grounds and amusement parks, etc., or the destruction of the environment, atmosphere, oceans, and fresh waters, as well as mountains and the climate in various ways. Basically, it is all the degenerate machinations of every kind that have caused climate change through the already existing and still uncontrollably growing gigantic overpopulation, and have thus already brought about tremendous natural disasters and storms. All the degenerate machinations unleashed by overpopulation resemble the earliest tale of the Pandora myth by the poet Hesiod, which relates that Zeus, the supreme god in Greek mythology, had the beautiful, seductive woman Pandora made by the artistically gifted fire god Hephaestus, and one day she was given a golden box to give to all human beings, but forbade them to open it. After a short time, however, Pandora herself opened the box, as Greek mythology relates, whereby all the evils previously unknown to mankind, such as toil, disease, all evil and death, etc., escaped from the box and have ruled the world ever since. This was part of the punishment for mankind as a result of the fire stolen by Prometheus. The thawing of the permafrost also goes back to the degenerate machinations of rampant overpopulation, for the thawing of the permafrost releases methane gas deposits in permafrost areas, in mountains, deep lakes, and in the oceans, which are toxic to human beings in large quantities and also destroy the climate, thus also dangerously damaging the Arctic and Antarctic, as well as the surrounding ocean waters down to their bottom and their living beings. And due to the constantly expanding degenerate machinations of the endlessly growing overpopulation, at least today, the warming of the Arctic and Antarctic continues inexorably, whereby both ice continents are thawing more and more quickly, just as, for example, the Siberian permafrost areas, which have already begun to thaw permanently. Microbes that have been inactive for a while are already beginning to process the carbon bound in plant remains at an early stage, with the result that, in addition to other newly developing greenhouse gases, a new and additional release of greenhouse gases is also taking place and causing additional damage to the climate. And if the whole overpopulation madness and the degenerate machinations resulting from it are not finally stopped, then an all-destructive climate collapse is ultimately imminent, which can at least wipe out an enormous amount or possibly all higher life. The fact is that due to progressive warming, not only the Arctic and Antarctic but also the Siberian permafrost is thawing, in particular due to the microbes that process the carbon bound in plant remains in the permafrost regions, thus producing new greenhouse gases, as I have already said. So in addition to the actual global warming, which is the fault of the degenerate machinations of Earthling overpopulation, there are also natural factors, which will further the destruction of the climate, as Svath explained to me in great detail back in the 1940s, and laid out for me everything that will happen. So, as a result of the degeneracy caused by overpopulation so far and which will continue to be caused, many more greenhouse gases will enter the atmosphere and continue to have a very negative effect on the climate, much more and to a greater extent than is happening as a result of climate change itself. The whole thing is effectively a vicious circle, because all the overpopulation degeneracies increase and amplify the total greenhouse gases to such an extent that further global warming brings other factors of climate destruction into play. These include not only the thawing of the permafrost and the further increase in methane gas emissions from the huge herds of cattle and other animals and various creatures, which will release even more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, but also other things that occur on a purely natural basis. The whole Earth, according to Sixteenth, is a huge storehouse of organic carbon, leaking very high levels of carbon into the atmosphere through global warming and precisely through climate change and effective climate destruction. According to your very accurate Playaran measurements, the average temperature on Earth has already risen by 1.4 degrees, while Earth scientists still maintain that this is not yet the case. The fact that the ground does not freeze evenly everywhere, but only in places, depending on the regions, may perhaps lead to incorrect measurements and to the fact that the earthly scientific average temperature measurements do not correspond to the exact Playaran measurements. As far as I know, when the mercury column drops below -6 degrees on an annual average, the ground then freezes completely, and if this cold persists for a long time, the ground freezes very deeply into it. As for example in certain areas of Siberia and Canada, where the permafrost depth can reach 1,500 meters, as Sixteenth proved to me on the spot in the 1940s by measuring the depth in Siberia. During an approximately 3-month journey into the past, he showed me a permafrost soil culture several meters thick, which he had created especially for me to study, and which he allowed to thaw slowly in my presence so that I could observe all the processes. So I saw how, after thawing, the culture very quickly became very active with microbes coming to life and feasting on the plant remains and other organic materials present in the culture, with these microbes displaying tremendous microbial activity. In the process, they carried out a veritable orgy of decomposition, which I was able to observe and experience in a lifelike way on special apparatus. I learned how the microbes became more and more active and developed a great deal of heat, causing the permafrost culture to thaw ever faster and deeper downwards. This process also began some time ago in the permanent permafrost areas on Earth, where the microbes have been producing a lot of heat through their metabolism for a long time, whereby they have begun to thaw the permafrost areas more and more under their own power, as is also the case in the depths of the oceans and in deep lakes, where the microbes also convert the deep frozen carbon quantities into carbon dioxide, and thus the methane gases dissolve, reach the Earth's surface as a greenhouse gas and thus into the atmosphere and have a negative influence on the climate. Sixteenth also let me see, taught me and explained in addition, which was extremely interesting to observe and experience, how the microbes broke down everything and incorporated the carbon contained in the plant remains etc. into carbon dioxide and methane. This, whereby a large part of the carbon escapes into the atmosphere as methane and thus contributes more and more massively to Earth and climate warming. But I could also see how the microbes, through their great heat generation, thawed the soil further and deeper down, as is also happening now in modern times through the thawing in the permafrost regions as a result of global warming and climate warming and through the action of the microbes on the Earth.
My father Sixteenth taught you during the nearly 2 decades that you spent mostly in the earthly past to very far back in time, as well as into the distant future, a lot of interesting things that will remain hidden to earthly researchers and scientists for centuries to come. At the same time, I must confess that I, too, could never experience or learn much of all that you have seen. Experienced and learned through my father in the earthly past and future, as well as through his instruction, consequently I know everything concerning your explanations only from my father's annals.
I hear regret in your voice, my friend.
This is not news to me, for I know that you know how to listen to voices and judge them.
It's good, but we have strayed from the actual topic, forgetting that we are waiting for the call for you because you will be called away. So I would like to get back to the actual topic and address the thing that the Foan is saying, and that I think the 11 tips regarding energy saving are ridiculous. To which I will say the following, which will probably take some time.
Energy-saving tips from the FOEN Federal Office for the Environment equals irresponsible, illogical negative suggestion.
1. Choose green electricity instead of the standard offer. The fact is, the production of the devices and equipment, etc., that have to be designed and manufactured to generate green electricity from renewable energies such as wind power, solar power, hydropower, as well as geothermal and heating resources, etc., alone require enormous amounts of electrical energy. These enormous amounts of electrical energy and power, which alone are required for the manufacture and production of all the necessary devices and equipment, can simply not be generated as green electricity, because all the technical possibilities necessary for this are currently lacking, even long into the future. Consequently, all energy and power must be produced in the traditional way, whereby nuclear power and power from coal-fired power plants, etc., are in the foreground, and green power can only be produced in small quantities at present, and also for a long time to come. So it is illogical and nonsensical to choose green electricity instead of from the standard supply, because quite simply enough, green electricity cannot be produced either now or in the near future. Consequently, the idea of choosing green electricity is not only illogical, but ill-considered and stupid. And moreover, it deludes the human beings into believing something unrealistic, which cannot be realized either today or tomorrow, nor in the foreseeable future. 2. LED lamps instead of incandescent bulbs. The fact is, just as the production of light bulbs requires a great deal of electrical energy and power, this is also the case for the production of LED lamps, whereby energy and power cannot yet be generated by green electricity, but only by conventional standard production. So in this respect too, the possibility of managing LED lamp production with green electricity is not yet given, because it cannot be generated in sufficient quantities for a long time yet. In addition to the fact that green electricity cannot be produced for the production of LED lamps, it must be remembered that the disadvantages of LED lamps must also be taken into account, and that these are absolutely not of a harmless nature, not even if the whole thing is played down by LED manufacturers, LED advocates, and researchers and scientists. The fact is, LED light can promote the death of visual cells in human beings and in all living beings in general, as the Plejaren have researched and demonstrated with absolute certainty, which means that the bluish light of LEDs is very damaging to the eyes in the long run, which will increasingly lead to visual difficulties and eye inflammations in many human beings in the future. And this will be so, as the Plejaren have said, and also when attempts are made to prevent this danger in LED lamps by adding light orange tints to them. This attempt, it is explained, is only a drop in the ocean, because this slight change does not change much in terms of damage to the eyes, because another ultra-fine blue light nuance that damages eyesight cannot be eliminated, because it cannot be perceived by earthly researchers and scientists due to their ignorance and lack of technical possibilities, and also cannot be neutralized. The proportion of blue light contained in LED light alone is, according to your Plejaren findings, too high for the eyes. Consequently, this is to be concealed by earthly technology with an orange tint. But this does not prevent the, until now, still invisible and eye-damaging ultra-blue light from remaining unchanged and harmful, and thus no more positive effect can be achieved. On this matter, you, Patar, did, after all, privately give me the following explanation on the 8th of October 2018, which I have retrieved and written down verbatim.
According to our research results, human beings on Earth, precisely those who frequently come into contact with LED light, will have to reckon with increased eye problems in the future because the LED light passes through the cornea, unhindered, and attacks the densely populated color-sensitive sensory cells in the macula or in the area of the retina. This also corresponds to the core point of sharp vision. And there, an inflammatory process can also be triggered and long-term damage caused, as well as promoting age-related macular degeneration, as our exact research results prove very precisely. The intensity of the cold white LED light can therefore damage the eyes in the very long term. It has to be said that LED lamps are optimal in terms of savings as well as their eco-balance, because they last longer than the other light sources, produce less waste, and outperform all other energy lamps by their low energy consumption, and also have a long lifespan. However, if the danger that ultra-blue light can pose in terms of macular damage is taken into account, then it surpasses any good and also any value in terms of a return on investment, because healthy eyesight cannot be equated with any material value. As far as ultra-blue light is concerned, this damages the pigment cells, which is as yet unknown in earthly research circles, as is also the fact that in LED light, in addition to blue light, there is also as yet undiscovered ultra-blue light, which is harmful to eyesight. The whole thing gradually leads to the overproduction of a protein substance, which as a result of a chain reaction leads to the death of the photoreceptors and thus to the restriction or even loss of vision. With regard to a high light intensity of 6,000 lux, it turns out that this high lux number of any light source leads to dangerous inflammatory processes in the eyes, whereby the death of the photoreceptors is promoted and also actually occurs. However, if a low light intensity of only about 500 lux is used, as is especially the case indoors, then impairment of the retina occurs. If we look at the advantages and disadvantages with regard to the life cycle assessment, as these are specified in Europe, then with regard to electric lamps, it emerges that every illuminant of all kinds has advantages and disadvantages. Although it is basically a fact that the electricity consumption of a lamp according to the energy mix, as it is, for example, on Earth in Europe, leaves a deeper ecological imprint than the manufacture and disposal of LED lamps, even if the illuminants contain harmful materials. Not only the actual blue light, but also the ultra-blue light damages the retina of the eyes, whereby the visual cells are also damaged by an accelerated aging process, because the cells produce more lipofuscin or waste products, which produce certain deposits and dark spots on the retina. This, however, corresponds to an age-related incurable disease, which is accelerated by the process of blue light as well as ultra-blue light, especially when the eyes are exposed unprotected to LED light, but also to other intense light sources, such as strong work lamps, headlights, monitors or television sets, etc. The negative effect of blue light and ultra-blue light of LED light in the dark is particularly harmful, because in the dark not only the eyes are damaged, but also the so-called inner hours falls out of sync, because blue and ultra-blue light cause sleep disturbances. If blue or ultra-blue light falls on the eyes, even for a short time, melatonin production inevitably stops, disrupting the sleep rhythm and causing sleep disturbance. Possible consequences are not only these disturbances, but also diabetes in the long term. Just as every light in the darkness stimulates the smallest molecular structures of the body to produce melatonin, resulting in drowsiness, the LED light through the ultra-blue light radiation has the opposite effect, causing the body to become susceptible to sleep disturbances as well as to a vegetative change, dystonia. This corresponds to a series of different symptoms which are connected with a malfunction of the vegetative nervous system, and thus of those nerves which cannot be controlled at will. This results in symptoms such as cramps and cardiovascular problems, nervousness and sleep disorders, as well as obesity with the metabolic syndrome diabetes mellitus, so a higher blood sugar level and therefore also sugar in the urine. Until today, all LED lamps in the earthly trade are not exempt from ultra-blue light. Because in this respect, in all LED research areas, ultra-blue light is still absolutely unknown, and its existence is also not yet ascertainable. What is available on the market are partly good products that have yellow-orange tinted glass bodies, whereby this tint filters out the blue light in the LED light to a large extent and thus reduces the danger to the eyes. However, as a result of ignorance with regard to ultra-blue light, which has approximately the same effect as actual blue light, which is largely filtered out, the danger of damage to the pigment cells, etc. remains as I have explained everything in detail.
So that PTA is your explanations from the 8th of October 2018, to which, however, I have something to add, which relates to the following facts, which arguably contribute to the fact that LED lamps, in addition to endangering eyesight through the blue light and ultra-blue light, also have other disadvantages such as
A. LED lamp production requires rare earths. B. LED lamps are relatively expensive to buy. C. LED lamps are not as powerful as, for example, halogen lamps. D. Inexpensive LED lamps lose their luminous intensity and light quality relatively quickly. E. Dimmability of LED lamps is extremely complicated. Rare earths are effectively precious commodities, and their extraction is just as destructive to the landscape and land as any other exploitation of earth resources. Environmental and health risks. Wikipedia, the metallurgical processes involved in smelting and refining sulfide ores heavily pollute the air with the toxic fumes produced. The production of a single ton of rare earths generates around 9,600 to 12,000 cubic meters of toxic waste gases containing dust, hydrofluoric acid, sulfuric acid, and sulfur dioxide, as well as around 75 cubic meters of acidic wastewater and around 1 ton of radioactive sludge. All rare earth-producing enterprises in the Bio2 region produce about 10 million tons of all kinds of wastewater annually, most of which is disposed of without proper treatment. The ratio of pure rare earth to processing residues is 1:2,000. That is to say, the extraction of 1 ton of rare earth produces 2,000 tons of byproducts. The residues are fed into settling plants and deposited. The tailings ponds in the region, which have been in use for more than 50 years, now contain 160 million tons of residues and 17.5 million cubic meters of wastewater. The waste products contain hydrofluoric and sulfuric acid and even radioactive thorium. Naturally, this pollutes the environment to a not inconsiderable degree. The rare earths are very rare and sought after, as well as very expensive special metals, about which I found the following explanations on the internet. Rare earth elements is a generic term for a group of individual metals or chemical elements that belong to the third group of the periodic table except actinium and the lanthanides. With the exception of promethium, many of the rare earths occur in association in nature. In detail, the following elements belong to the group, as well as the 14 elements following lanthanum. The lanthanoids: 1. Scandium Sc, atomic number 21,2, yttrium Y, atomic number 39,3, lanthanum La, Atomic number 57, 4, cerium Ce. Atomic number 58, 5, dysprosium Dy. Atomic number 66, 6, europium U. Atomic number 63, 7, erbium Atomic number 8, gadolinium Gd. Atomic number 64, 9, holmium Ho. Atomic number 67, 10, lutetium Lu. Atomic number 71, 11, neodymium Nd. Atomic number 60, 12, praseodymium Pr. Atomic number 59, 13, promethium Pm. Atomic number 61, 14, samarium Sem. Atomic number 62, 15, terbium Tb. Atomic number 65, 16, thulium Tm. Atomic number 69, 17, ytterbium Yb. Atomic number 70.
The term rare earths is actually misleading because it dates back to the time when these elements were discovered. It is based on the fact that they were first found in rare minerals and isolated from them in the form of their oxides, formerly earths. Some cerium, yttrium, and neodymium are more abundant in the Earth's crust than lead, molybdenum, or arsenic. Thulium, the rarest of the rare earth elements, is still not as rare as gold or platinum. The similarity of the chemical properties and the already mentioned common occurrence in nature might make the separation of the rare earth metals complex and cost-intensive. However, it is often sufficient to use a cheaper mixed metal. The characteristic properties of each rare earth element are very different and exceptionally interesting. For example, gadolinium is the only rare earth element that is ferromagnetic, or lanthanum, which is a superconductor that loses all resistance to current flow at very low temperatures. These characteristics give each element an economic importance and are nowadays indispensable components in the production of metal alloys, special glasses, and superconductors. In China, rare earths have also been used for about 30 years to fertilize soils and feed livestock. Crops are said to produce significantly higher yields, and farm animals grow faster and have better feed conversion. Individual elements of the rare earth group and the group itself are traded either as raw materials or in a derivative form such as futures, options, certificates on international stock exchanges. An investor can only invest in the form of shareholdings in mining companies that explore or extract these metals. Their economic importance far exceeds their level of familiarity, the rare earths. Without them, almost nothing works in communications or environmental technology. The special metals are the precious metals of the 21st century. Without them, we are thrown back into the 20th or even 19th century. As the technological applications of rare earths have multiplied in recent decades, the demand for several of the less common and formerly quite obscure rare earths has increased dramatically, judges the U.S. Geological Survey USGS. Erbium, for example, increases the performance of fiber optic communication cables. Europium is used as red phosphorus for screens of monitors and televisions and cannot be replaced by any other substance. Rare earths, including cerium, are also used for autocatalysts. The fact that China is the largest producer of rare earths appears to be quite problematic for two reasons. Firstly, because of the danger of economic dependence, and secondly, because of the environmental impact of extracting the coveted raw materials. Several studies deal with the environmental and health-damaging effects of the mining of Se in the People's Republic of China. A case study commissioned by the German Federal Environmental Agency on the environmental and social impacts of rare earth extraction deals with the mining situation in Bayan Obo. The Bayan Obo C deposit and extraction site is located in Inner Mongolia in northern China. It is the world's largest deposit of light rare earths and is unique in that the mineralization here occurs in association with thorium, niobium, and iron. About 50% of China's production comes from the Bayan Obo deposits. What applies to this deposit can also be applied to most other mining areas in China. The study cites worrying impacts and effects on the environment. The employees of the mines also have to deal with health consequences in some cases.
3. Dry laundry on the line instead of in the tumbler. The fact is, drying laundry on the line is not possible, especially in cities and large villages, because the necessary space for hanging laundry is not available. Drying clothes on the line is therefore simply impossible for the inhabitants of cities and large villages due to the lack of open-air places. If the house owners and property managers do not specially build and provide such places for hanging up laundry on lines in the open air. Laundry hanging in the house is hardly possible in cities and large villages, with perhaps a few exceptions, because suitable terraces, attics and balconies would have to be available and provided by the house owners, etc., for drying laundry on lines. But this is certainly not the case. Because on the one hand, this would require completely different construction methods for houses, etc., in cities and large villages, and would drive the construction costs up to immense heights. So the whole thing is illusory with regard to drying laundry on the line, because it is only possible where everything is and will be set up accordingly. 4. Drink tap water instead of buying bottled water. The fact is, countless human beings of the ever more overflowing overpopulation find it absolutely impossible to get drinking water from any taps, whereby the reasons for this are so very diverse that they can probably not be enumerated. If one considers the need for pure mineral water, which cannot be taken or let out of the normal tap, which on the one hand is obtained solely and only from certain earthly sources, and must be pumped out of the Earth's interior, but on the other hand is unavoidable by many human beings due to health necessity to sustain life. Then, in this respect alone, the suggestion drink tap water instead of buying bottled water is more than just ill-considered and illusory. Many human beings are unable to drink tap water for health reasons, so they are just as dependent on buying bottled water as those human beings whose tap water is contaminated by chemically harmful substances or is otherwise dangerous to their health due to dirty and polluted influences. Millions of human beings in certain parts of the earth have no taps in their houses, huts, tents, etc., so they have to fetch and store their drinking water in bottles, barrels and other containers, often from kilometers away from ground cisterns, springs or shops. Similarly, many other human beings depend solely on rooftop cisterns for their water needs during the rainy seasons and store the water in bottles, jars and containers for months at a time. When the above facts are considered, then the nonsense of saying drink tap water instead of buying bottled water is very clear. Energy-saving tips from the FOEN Federal Office for the Environment = irresponsible, illogical, negative suggestion. 5. Buy seasonal vegetables instead of those from the greenhouse. The fact is, seasonal vegetables can only be bought if the corresponding planting and harvesting season is available, which means that only a certain period of time per year can be used for planting, harvesting, buying and eating. During the rest of the year, the human beings of the earth must provide themselves with other foodstuffs, which are not comparable with seasonal vegetables, but as a rule correspond to other foodstuffs of various kinds and must be stored correctly in order to remain edible. However, this storage, as well as the preparation for it, requires large amounts of electrical energy, as does the entire nationwide shipping, transport, sale, and food preparation from these foods. Seasonal vegetables also usually require large amounts of electrical energy, because in today's technical, electrical and electronic world, all foodstuffs are somehow processed, controlled, and sold via various energy channels, just as food preparation is usually carried out using electrical and electronic energy. It is illogical that vegetables from greenhouses should not be bought, because they are usually planted, grown and harvested according to the same principles as vegetables grown in the open air, which means that in both cases, chemical poisonous products are used to control pests and to help them thrive and grow. This is because the whole food business is dependent on it, because if nothing thrives and nothing grows, nothing can be sold and no profit can be made. Furthermore, the truth about greenhouse vegetables is that a lot of organic vegetables are planted, grown, nurtured, cared for, and harvested in greenhouses, because in such plants in particular, the least or no chemical toxins are introduced and are therefore not used. Many vegetables, usually seasonal vegetables, depend on the time during which they can be planted, grown and harvested, which can be the case both in the open and in greenhouses, whereby it normally makes practically no difference if everything is handled cleanly, correctly, and in accordance with nature. It is important to note that especially in organic vegetables grown in greenhouses and cultivated and harvested without chemical toxins, there are far fewer traces of toxins than in normal vegetables or organic vegetables grown outdoors, and contaminated by wind and weather with tiny chemical toxin particles suspended in the atmosphere. And this is specifically the case because the tiny chemical poison particles suspended in the atmosphere get into the vegetable plants driven by the wind and are absorbed by the vegetables, contaminating them. This also happens through the rain, which washes away the countless tiny poisonous particles suspended in the atmosphere, which then rains down on the outdoor vegetables and contaminates them, be they normal or organic vegetables, with the toxins from the atmosphere. And this corresponds to a fact that is vehemently denied by all so-called experts, be it the vegetable growers themselves or the doctors, professors, other scholars, scroungers and lobbyists, who, for profit, tell deliberately distorted lies, or who are effectively ignorant and gullible ignoramuses, or cunning know-it-alls and fact-twisters, to whom every truth is an abomination, and every harm to other human beings a jubilant satisfaction and joy.
What you say corresponds to our findings according to extremely precise investigations that we have carried out in many places on Earth on diverse outdoor vegetable varieties that you call normal and organic vegetables. Our very precise investigations have produced findings and results which show that no vegetables, fruits, herbs, and fruit are free of chemical toxins in all open-air vegetable, fruit, and fruit cultivations. This is because everything is contaminated with toxic substances by wind and rain as a result of the fact that the poisons are irresponsibly spread into nature all over the world, and consequently also spread in the atmosphere in the tiniest particles. These are then spread by the winds and washed out again by rain, which then rains down on all foodstuffs of every kind that are planted outdoors. Of course, the chemical poisons are further diluted in their mass by wind and rain, but not to such an extent that they become harmless, and to such an extent that there is no longer any toxic influence on the free-range food. So our research results indicate that in all earthly, normal, and organic vegetable, herb, fruit, and fruit-growing areas there are no toxin-free food products to be found, both in relation to all food cultivation, normal and organic, and so given whether the cultivation of the food is commercial or purely private. Although the amounts of toxins in natural foods, both normal and organic, vary worldwide and from one growing area to another, our research has shown that no natural foods in the world are free of toxic inclusions, and are therefore more or less harmful to health. This is because even the smallest and tiniest amounts of toxins of any kind in food, grown in the open or in greenhouses, as well as in otherwise produced food, always affect the health of human beings and cause suffering and illness, even incurability.
This is clear to me and I am aware of it, consequent to the fact that the determinations of the health authorities, researchers, scientists, and other people responsible for food with their claims that certain minimal amounts of toxins in food are harmless to human beings are brand black lies.
Any chemical poison, as well as any organic toxin, even in minimal quantities, even if it is really extremely small, is in any case harmful to health, and sooner or later causes suffering and illness. If, however, other claims are made, such as that certain low limits are tolerable and therefore not harmful to health, then this does not simply correspond to an untruth, but to a malicious lie and seduction by which entire populations are deceived, seduced into taking toxins and deliberately driven into suffering and disease.
We have talked about this before, and also in the sense that behind all this is the commercialism of the producers and the trade, as well as all the lies and deceit of those researchers, scientists and officials of administrative and health authorities who are bribed for their lying and advocacy of poisons, etc., and thereby enrich themselves financially. But to say any more about this is probably nonsensical, so I think I would better get on with commenting on the ill-considered and illogical energy-saving tips from the FON.
Energy-saving tips from the FON Federal Office for the Environment. Irresponsible, illogical, negative suggestion. 6. Eat pulses instead of meat. The fact is, pulses of all kinds are good food, but that no meat should be eaten is nonsensical and probably indicates that the originator of the energy-saving tips is vegetarian or vegan inclined and thinks that only vegetarianism and veganism could ensure a good and healthy lifestyle and quality of life. However, as a result of wrong views and delusions, it has been completely misunderstood and forgotten that, from a purely evolutionary point of view, the metabolism of human beings, or rather their metabolism, from a biological point of view, is fundamentally geared towards utilizing all possible and poison-free food. This means that human beings have been omnivorous from the earliest times, and moreover have mainly eaten all the food that is beneficial to them, and have also remained so to this day. Consequently, it is also unfair to denigrate or prohibit the human beings from eating meat, no matter in what way, if it is not vital for one or the other for health reasons. Effective fact, reality and truth is that, from an anatomical point of view, modern human beings, according to the course of their hominization and thus as Homo sapiens, were or are by nature neither a pure carnivore, nor a pure herbivore, nor a pure fruit eater or fructivore, for they were basically omnivores from the very beginning of their first existence. Against all the views, questions, opinions, conceits, theses, assertions, suppositions and folly raised by earthlings since time immemorial and also in the present day, with regard to whether and that earthling man is an omnivore, carnivore or pure herbivore or vegan or vegetarian, Svath taught me in a clear and distinct manner. So I learned that the metabolism of the human beings of the earth was fundamentally geared to omnivorousness, and thus to all good food for health, just like that of the Plejaren. In addition, the doctrine was that with regard to human food, everything non-toxic was useful and could be enjoyed if it tasted good to the human beings. Thus, since the emergence of human beings, everything was considered food, such as meat, all fruits and grains, all fruits and berries, as well as fish and other water creatures, all feathered creatures, all herbs, grasses, all creepers, snails, amphibians, and everything that tasted good and served as food. The fact that anatomical differences result from the eating behavior of human beings, whereby such behavior can appear as a result of suffering and illness, but especially as a result of delusions through which human beings mutate into pure carnivores or herbivores, and thus cheat their metabolism, which is geared to omnivorousness, shows itself unnaturally, especially differently in the chewing and digestion of food. The earthlings, like the Pleiaren, are omnivores by nature and thus since ancient times and not pure herbivores. Consequently, they differ fundamentally on the one hand from carnivorous predators and on the other hand from pure herbivores, such as deer and cattle, etc. But as omnivores, they have something in common with domestic pigs, which, as a domesticated form of the wild boar, eat both animal and vegetable food, and are thus also omnivores. Swarth explained that human beings are omnivores and therefore not carnivores only, who, contrary to the established opinion of vegetarians and vegans, can also live without animal products under certain circumstances. If the physique and teeth of an omnivorous, herbivorous or carnivorous human being are examined, then the teeth in particular stand out. For example, those of a human being who feeds only on meat are elongated, sharp and pointed. The reason for this, Swarth explained, is that the meat-eater has to tear the meat and move his teeth up and down to grind his food. In contrast, the molars of a human being would form a kind of stump and only move sideways if he only ate vegetable food, because this had to be crushed and ground. In the case of omnivorous human beings, on the other hand, their teeth are half-pointed, half-sharp and half-stumpy, and move up and down as well as sideways, thus tearing, crushing and crushing the food. These facts now presented should probably be enough to have also put eating pulses instead of meat in the correct light, and to say that this Barfu tip is also completely ill-considered and ignorant. And that brings me to the 7th FOEN tip. Energy-saving tips from the FOEN Federal Office for the Environment = unthinking, illogical, negative suggestion. 7. Take the train instead of the plane. The fact is, travelling from one place to another by train instead of by plane is all well and good if this is possible, and if conditions permit. But it is really only possible if the distances to be covered are not too far and not too inconvenient, so that a destination can still be reached in a reasonable time. Far away destinations that have to be reached in certain times cannot be reached by train, but only by aircraft in a reasonable period of time, if, for example, fixed times have been agreed upon that have to be kept. Nowadays, keeping fixed and agreed times is dependent on a lot of money, because throughout it is always said, time is money. Travelling by train is all well and good when it involves holidays, etc., where time plays no or at least little role. However, when it comes to train journeys to reach workplaces, the time dependency begins again, as does the problem of overcrowded trains, and especially reaching a station that is still in operation, which are becoming increasingly rare because more and more are being decommissioned as a result of austerity measures. It is also becoming more and more difficult to get to railway stations because there are no bus connections to the stations and back to the place of residence in outer wards, or the bus services are drastically reduced. This puts the human beings of the outer wards at a tremendous disadvantage, as a result of which in many cases only the inhabitants of villages or towns close to the railway stations can use train services regularly or sporadically. While many human beings, often very elderly, old people, in remote outer wards can only get to bus stations and railway stations and post offices by long walks, and thus cannot use trains. And all this only because the railways and the post office are closing their necessary counters in order to be able to enrich themselves even more by excuses regarding necessity than is already the case. Because their services are being driven up with ever more horrendous price surcharges, and the upper bosses can pocket ever higher salaries. And the problem mentioned that neither a train journey nor a bus journey to a railway station, to a post office or anywhere else, nor a flight with an aeroplane to somewhere else is possible, because it is simply impossible, and the infrastructure destroyed by the railway administrators themselves does not allow this. Among other problems, is quite obviously not known to the FON, as a result of which it also propagates nothing more and nothing less than an ill-considered, stupid and senseless proposal into the world. As far as the next energy-saving tip from the FON is concerned, there is also something to be said about it. Energy-saving tips from the FON Federal Office for the Environment = unthinking, illogical negative suggestion. 8. Holidays nearby or in Europe instead of long-distance journeys. The fact is that this statement is also not exactly characterized by much intellect, reason and intelligence in relation to or in Europe instead of long-distance travel, because such a contradiction is directly ridiculous. Because even holiday trips out of the country and precisely to the far reaches of Europe can absolutely be described as long-distance travel and not as holidays in the vicinity. A holiday in the vicinity can only be considered and understood in this way, and can only mean that a holiday should only be taken in one's own area of residence and country, whereby all foreign countries must be excluded. This is precisely according to the old proverb, which in its effective origin was formed as follows: "Why go far, for the beauty and goodness of home is so near," but in the course of time became, "Why go far, for the good is so near." The addition "or in Europe" instead of travelling far away is absolutely nonsensical and effectively contradictory, because according to the whole statement, when it is looked at and considered logically, the meaning "holiday nearby or in Europe instead of travelling far away" is in itself inconsistent and contradicts itself. Which also proves that neither logic nor the German language is mastered by the person who thought up and designed this energy-saving tip. However, as far as the effective energy-saving tip is concerned, which is probably meant by the incorrect and contradictory sentence presentation due to illogic and the failure to master the German language, it probably refers to the fact that no holiday trips should be made to distant countries outside Europe. Accordingly, the energy-saving tip in German should correctly be formulated as follows: no long-distance travel outside Europe, but only holidays in your own country and in Europe. This would then say exactly what is suggested and meant in writing, namely that holidays should only be taken in one's own country or in Europe. If, however, the old proverb is observed that says, "Why go far afield? For the beauty and goodness of home are so close at hand," then this can very well be brought into connection with holidays close by, and understood in such a way that no long-distance journeys should be made for holiday purposes that take place outside one's own home country, although the nearby neighbouring countries can still be taken into consideration. This is to be seen and evaluated in this way because the term long-distance travel means that these are trips to faraway places, whereby since time immemorial a very specific definition has been used, namely trips overseas to the USA, Asia, Australia, Canada or Africa, etc. The term long-distance travel is also used to refer to trips to other countries. As a rule, a flight has to be booked for this in order to be able to cover the great distances more quickly, or a long-distance journey has to be made by ship. This is also the case with a cruise with all its amenities on board, although this is also to be classified under the motto of holiday long-distance travel, because a cruise and a holiday flight are only a means to an end in order to be able to see distant countries, etc. The cruise passengers tend to look more at the cost of the trip. The long-distance travellers tend to look at the price and the great travel comfort, and to be able to brag and shine afterwards about where they have been everywhere. In reality, however, they have learned nothing about the lives and living conditions of human beings, nor about the historical and contemporary history of the countries they have carelessly travelled to, but have empty skulls and remain stupid and ignorant. The fact is that when people go on long-distance journeys, on the one hand, it is only the attraction of the new and different that lures them, as well as the subsequent behaviour of being able to boast that, allegedly, they once got to know a completely different culture. Whereas in reality, there can be no question of having got to know it at all. Asian temple towns are only walked through. The Grand Canyon is briefly seen. Elephants are ridden through jungles specially prepared for tourists, or harmless sharks used to human beings are swum in the sea, but nothing, absolutely nothing, is explored and nothing is learned. This is in contrast to experienced globetrotters and individual long-distance travellers who spend years travelling all over the world, either professionally or on their own initiative, who also work in the exotic countries, explore everything as a result of their interest, and learn a great deal in the process. In the end, however, it is also necessary to take into account, when talking about long-distance journeys that should not be made, due to energy saving, that holiday trips to European countries further away than just those bordering the home country, holidays in the vicinity, must also be mentioned as long-distance journeys and destinations, because these can only be reached in a profitable time by plane, for example, England, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, Holland, Sweden, Denmark, Poland and Greece, etc. if we start from Switzerland. Consequently, the energy-saving tip holiday nearby or in Europe instead of long-distance travel is completely contradictory to this. Energy-saving tips from the FOEN Federal Office for the Environment = irresponsible, illogical, negative suggestion. 9. Take the train to work instead of the car. The fact is, in today's world, this tip is completely at odds with the effective ways of reaching places of work. Because on the one hand, the massive overpopulation forces the working class, which is diversely active in many professions, to accept and perform work where it is offered to them. And on the other hand, for many reasons in this respect, it is the case today that many workers can only reach their place of work by roads and paths because they cannot be reached by public transport, but only by private vehicles. This is because, on the one hand, there is neither a train nor public transport to the place of work, or because the journey to the place of work and, of course, the journey home is either complicated due to multiple changes or takes far too long due to time consumption. By train and public transport, 1.5 hours to work and the same amount of time to get home may be just about acceptable. But if both times for the outward and return journey are longer, as is the case with 2 to 3 hours in total, then the whole thing may no longer be reasonable. Therefore, if a car makes it possible to reach the place of work as well as after work, and also the journey home in a time that does not take 2 to 3 hours in total by car, but only 15 to 30 minutes or perhaps 45 minutes to an hour, then this is probably much more reasonable than using the train and a means of public transport. The railway and public transport can be used by people who only travel from place to place, from place to city or from city to city, and who have their workplaces there, and also good rail connections and additional public connections. For all those employees, however, who have other difficult and time-consuming ways to work, if they had to use the train and public transport, such a time-consuming undertaking is effectively unreasonable because it has harmful consequences for health, such as stress, constant tiredness and irritability, sleep and psychological disorders, which ultimately degenerate and lead to dissatisfaction and other ills. Many human beings have no choice but to be away from home for the whole of their weekly working hours and to rent a room elsewhere because their place of work is too far away to reach in a reasonable time, and then also to manage the journey home. And in this respect, I speak from experience, because my father and I also had to rent rooms at the place of work, because the journey to the place of work was just as long at 3 hours as the 3 hours it would have taken to drive home again. So the stupid suggestion, take the train to work instead of the car, does not work, even if no car is used to get to work. The office gummies who create such nonsense suggestions have no idea whatsoever about real reality and its truth. Their crazy ideas, which are actually delusions, are absolutely unrealistic, and they have no idea whatsoever of the urban-rural conflict that exists as a result of the social injustices in the country, not only in politics, but also with regard to the fact that, on the one hand, for the village and city populations, the journeys to work and home can be better managed by public transport, precisely by train and bus, than is possible for the rural population. This alone creates an unbridgeable gap between workers in the countryside who have to deal with completely different conditions to reach their places of work than those who live in villages and cities, and can make use of good train connections and other means of public transport. If the whole thing is analysed from a broader perspective, social injustice also shows that the rural population, who have to travel to work by car and back home at the end of the working day, have many disadvantages compared to the village and city dwellers who can use the train and public transport. Villagers and city dwellers can sit quietly on the train or bus, while away the time on the road, or use it for any personal activities, and they do not have to worry about driving and riding a vehicle, nor about traffic rules, nor about the safety of road and street users. Villagers and city dwellers also drive cheaper with their tickets and season tickets than the rural population, who have to pay high petrol and oil prices for their cars, as well as service, maintenance and repair costs, insurance and road tolls, etc., because they are dependent on private vehicles or private cars. The village-urban-rural conflict is to be reconsidered in more than just a simple way in this respect alone, because in addition to the ill-considered matter of the Fowen taking the train to work instead of the car, There are other things that actually have nothing to do with it, but which I nevertheless want to address, because these also have to be considered. For example, with regard to the completely false opinion of certain parties that the villages and towns have to bear the burden of the city centre, whereby the rural population would be supported and could benefit because they would have to be financially supported by the villages and towns. This is, of course, nonsense, because the rural population can very well finance itself and is also less susceptible to debt than the cities and the state, especially with regard to its administrative areas, which are constantly indebting their coffers, especially the cantonal coffers and state coffers. This is because more and more is spent than is collected in taxes, etc., and consequently more and more debts are incurred because those responsible in the cantons and the government are incapable of financial management. On the other hand, these debt makers assume that it is all the same to them if the state gets more and more into debt, because it is not their personal deficits that are being made, but those of the state, and that is none of their business. In their unconscionability, they do not care that they are personally contributing to the growing mountain of national debt. So they also do not think about the fact, because they do not care, that on the one hand, in their lousy and irresponsible work ethic and way of acting, they are driving the state into ever higher debts with their financial profligacy, instead of reducing existing debts and creating a debt-free state. And they do this, on the one hand, according to the idiotic delusions of those who, in their stupidity, claim that a state is only a good state if it has debts, because this boosts the entire economy, etc. On the other hand, all these irresponsible elements, in their lousy work ethic and way of acting, still have the cheek to rob the state, and thus the taxpayers, by collecting high salaries for their criminal activities, which they do not really earn in any way, but effectively scam with their anti-state and debt-increasing machinations. And against these elements, who damage the state, the people and the homeland by incurring debts and by making wrong decisions, etc., all those righteous rulers and state administrators who laboriously strive for correct, good and proper financial management and governance have no chance at all. As a result, they toil in vain, because everything they can do and make so good, correct and perfect in their conscientiousness will be made a pig of. In the end, their righteousness is still rewarded by the fact that they are vilified for their efforts to bring the state up to scratch and to create freedom from national debt, which could then also lower the tax rate for the people. If, however, a good and righteous person comes into the financial administration, such as Ueli Maurer in Bern, for example, who is able to manage the financial system well and correctly, and, instead of incurring debts, is able to save and generate finances for debt reduction, then this is rewarded with all his efforts and success being made a pig of, and being squandered again in short order by other offices and financially incompetent elements. This is only said in passing, because it is a disgrace for all those who act in this pathetic and irresponsible manner and destroy the hard work of people who do their duty in their office well and correctly and are pushed into the mud as thanks for it. Energy-saving tips from the FOEN Federal Office for the Environment, irresponsible, illogical, negative suggestion. 10. Form carpools instead of sitting alone in the car. The fact is, when this energy-saving tip is put under the microscope, then it corresponds to something that must be thoroughly considered from two sides, because carpooling offers both good and noteworthy advantages, but also tangible and not insignificant disadvantages. And these must be listed both ways, as well as the fact that the whole thing must also be understood in a completely different way, because I am sure that what the Fowen tip means by carpooling has fundamentally nothing to do with a carpool, which, in logical terms, clearly expresses the fact that several persons jointly undertake a journey with commercially oriented means of transport. And according to the clear and unambiguous definition of the good German language, such a carpool takes place when several or many persons make a journey as a driving collective or passengers with a larger means of transport, such as a train, long-distance bus, post bus, omnibus or tram, and thus travel to a specific destination or various destinations. However, this has nothing to do with what the Fowen falsely and misleadingly means by carpooling, because the Fowen personality who created the proposal in writing is quite obviously not sufficiently proficient in German, as is unfortunately also often the case in Germany itself, with persons who have to do written public relations work, but who only know Volksdeutsch, but not the sophisticated German language. Well, the Bafu person who does not speak German to a good extent, and I'm sure of this, had something quite different in mind when she came up with her idea, namely carpooling, which has nothing to do with commercially run carpools. Carpooling refers solely to the fact that commuters living specifically in peri-urban or urban peripheries, in cities and suburban areas or in rural areas, use carpooling as passengers in the private cars of other car owners. This is usually done for professional reasons, specifically when persons have to travel regularly between two places, to work and then back home, not using carpools and thus not commercially designed public transport for their outward and return journeys, but carpooling in private automobiles, such as cars and private minibuses. There are several things to consider in relation to this, such as the following. 1. Who can use carpooling and who can use it when? Where is it possible? For what purpose? And which specific or unspecified vehicles or cars can be used? 2. Carpooling may very well be a good idea, but it has nothing to do with carpooling, as has been proven in earlier times when commercial passenger transport was still carried out with horse-drawn carriages, such as hackney carriages, carriages of all kinds. Hackney carriages are the 1, 2, and multi-horse carriages, company carriages, landaus, sleighs, chaises and buggies, etc., and is the case today with means of transport of a more modern kind. Even in earlier times, however, it was possible for human beings to be taken in by carpooling, when in a purely private way people could ride on any horse-drawn carriage, for or without payment, as is also still the case today. The whole issue of carpooling is effectively not to be seen from the point of view of carpooling, which was already carried out in the past with commercially run horse-drawn transport, which has long since fallen out of favour and has been replaced in modern times by the railways and buses, etc., precisely as an inevitable consequence of technical development. Carpooling in this sense is normal nowadays, although this is not what the Fowen actually means, but rather carpooling, which is to be understood under the wrong Fowen designation. Although this carpooling is dependent on good and important contacts that first have to be made, although this should not be too difficult nowadays via the internet. 3. Carpooling can certainly be advocated, precisely in the sense that several persons share a vehicle in order to travel to and reach a certain destination, or several destinations together. instead of one or two persons using the car alone, while several other seats in the car remain unused. The use of carpooling for regular daily journeys, usually to reach the place of work and back home at the end of the day, together with several persons, has certain advantages, for example, fair sharing of transport costs or petrol costs. Depending on the case and the agreement, it may also be possible to negotiate driver facilitation. For example, if the driving and steering of the car is alternately handled by the owner person and then by the carpool users, perhaps a different person every day or every week. It is also appropriate that all those who take part in such a car-sharing scheme and who have their own vehicle use it and make it available when it is their turn to drive the car. One-off or sporadic carpooling is a different situation because there are significant differences, which are also scheduled differently and cannot be assessed in the same way as a rule. On the one hand, carpooling for work and home is designed for specific times and also for the medium or long term. While on the other hand, one-off or sporadic carpooling is only used for different purposes, and a specific route is only travelled once or only sporadically. It is also unlikely that a person who uses a carpooling service in this way will drive the vehicle himself and will usually, with exceptions, also pay a fee to the car owner for the journey. In principle, costs can be saved in any case when using carpooling, be it commuters who commute to work every day and back home at the end of the day, or one-time users or sporadic users of such carpooling. 4. In fact, carpooling involves travelling considerable distances, which of course involves immense costs. As is also the case with carpooling by commercial public transport, although, as already mentioned, carpooling can save a lot if petrol costs can be shared among several carpoolers. Another plus point for carpooling is the time saved, which can be quite enormous depending on the volume of traffic and the way of driving. Whereas otherwise this is not the case with carpooling because commercial public transport operates according to fixed timetables, and the times calculated for it have to be adhered to. Carpooling in particular can be very good and time-saving if, for example, children regularly or sporadically have to be taken privately by car to school or elsewhere and then also picked up again. In such carpooling situations, neighbouring children who are friends can also be included in an arranged carpool and looked after by the driver during the journey, which means that the other parents, as a rule probably the mothers, can use their time elsewhere for housework or other activities. The use of carpooling also reduces the volume of traffic and thus also brings great benefits for nature as a whole and its fauna and flora, as well as for the atmosphere and thus for the climate, the entire environment including humanity. This is because only one car is used for several persons when using car sharing, and not 3 or 4 of the car sharing users, which means that 3 to 4 cars produce less climate-damaging CO2, which also means that the atmosphere is less polluted. 5. The advantages mentioned so far must of course also be weighed up against disadvantages, which are also not always insignificant when using car-sharing services and do indeed occur time and again. Unfortunately, the benefits and harms of carpooling must also be considered and weighed up, be it in terms of accidents, which are becoming more numerous, more dangerous, and more deadly as a result of the ever-increasing volume of traffic, or be it due to any other circumstances. Another major disadvantage arises, for example, in the relationship that, in the case of agreed and thus fixed carpooling, a dependency arises among the carpooling partnership because in this way a fixed obligation is entered into and this must be adhered to. If, however, the obligation cannot be fulfilled at short notice, this can lead to considerable and even enormous difficulties, which can even cause and entail legal action, legal proceedings, and claims for damages, which can be very costly under certain circumstances. Similarly, this can also be the case if carpooling is only used once or sporadically, and difficulties arise in this way. If a person does not drive a car, then all other persons who use the carpooling service are inevitably dependent on other persons driving the car and, as the saying goes, are at the mercy of the person who is responsible for driving the car. Particular attention must be paid to this if the driver is under enormous psychological pressure, which, however, cannot be recognized by laypersons without the appropriate expertise, and consequently this is to be assessed as a serious and dangerous disadvantage. If the driver is inattentive, slow in perception, flexibility and reaction, or even inhibited, then this corresponds to a factor that is not only a disadvantage, but is also life-threatening in relation to driving and steering a car, both for him or herself and for the passengers and road users on the road. In the case of carpooling, insurance cover for carpool users must be compulsory, just as they must also have their own accident insurance and personal liability insurance, just as the owner must have appropriate liability insurance and passenger insurance for their car to cover and cover personal injury, just as this must be the case for commercial carpooling with public transport, which covers costs for doctors, medicine, hospitalization, and possibly disability or death in the event of an accident, etc.
And with this, I have once again said in plain language what I must necessarily say again and again, as I have always had to, because the eyes and senses of the earthlings must be opened. For which, however, I expect no thanks and also reap none, but am attacked in the opposite direction and insulted as a defeatist, a liar and a cheat, a sick crank and an insane do-gooder. But I do not care, because I know that I am right, and that the future will be very bad if all the degenerated evils of destructive machinations by Earth humans and their rampant overpopulation are not put to an end, which can only happen through a worldwide birth stop lasting several years and a worldwide strictly controlled birth control. This can only be done by a worldwide birth stop of several years and a strictly controlled birth control all over the world, in the way that first no offspring can be brought into the world for certain years, and then the production of offspring is strictly controlled and monitored by the state. And this must be the case because every newborn earthling, in order to preserve and prosper its life, etc., makes many other degenerate machinations unavoidable, through which the planet Earth is further harassed, nature and its fauna and flora destroyed and annihilated, as well as the climate driven more and more into a hopeless climatic catastrophe. But if I now have to add something to what I am sensing when I think about today's hopeless traffic volume, which in my opinion will soon be a chaos that can no longer be controlled, then this is probably no surprise for the future. Because even back in the 1960s, when I was over 20 years old, I saw that in densely populated agglomerations, public transport was used much more than in peri-urban and rural areas. I think that even at that time it was not simply the topography or the geographical location, and also not the quality of the transport services that were responsible for these differences. In my opinion, the mentality and human preferences played a role then, and also play a role today. On the one hand, or rather the certain preferences, pronounced inclinations and behaviors of the human beings. If we look at the choice of means of transport, I already observed back then, when I was still working in Zurich and Bern, that there were big differences in this respect. I was also able to observe again and again in those years that, depending on the time of year and in the course of technical progress, great differences in the use of vehicles and machines came to light, as did enormous differences in this respect as a result of the wages of the employees. And it was precisely in this respect that I was able to perceive what was thereby expressed in many different ways, also in relation to the fact that higher earners afforded more expensive and luxurious cars than was possible for the lower-earning working class, who had to make do with cheaper vehicles, such as the VW Beetles produced in Germany, the French Citroën 2CV Duck corrugated iron barracks, Wikipedia, 1949-1990, the Renault R4 Wikipedia, 1961-1992, and the Italian Fiat Cinquecento Wikipedia, 1957-1975, etc. I also noticed that slowly but surely, more and more human beings were using their cars to commute between home and work, which meant that the commercial carpool vehicles were used less and less. This was due to the fact that the working class had more and more money at their disposal, on the one hand due to debt, and on the other hand due to rising wages, and as a result they were able to buy their own cars, which they used for self-driving to and from their place of work. This, in addition to the fact that they were also used in leisure time and at weekends, meant that the rapidly increasing number of car owners had less and less need for commercial carpool transport, especially the inhabitants of suburban and urban catchment areas, as well as villages and extensive rural areas, who acquired more and more private vehicles and thus became self-mobile and independent of all commercial carpools. Since then, however, this has led to degeneracy up to the present day, because more and more private cars have come onto the roads, which nowadays produce traffic avalanches in excess and constantly clog up all traffic routes more and more, causing many kilometer-long traffic jams, which already lead to time losses that not infrequently cause great financial damage, and sometimes even cost human lives. And the fact that thousands upon thousands of tons of CO2 are emitted into the atmosphere, poisoning it more and more and causing suffering and illness among human beings, is of no concern to anyone, nor is the fact that these greenhouse gases are also destroying the climate more and more, and will one day lead to climate collapse.
Energy-saving tips from the Foreign Federal Office for the Environment, =unthinking, illogical negative proposal. 11. Drive an electric car instead of a petrol car. The fact is, this Foreign energy-saving tip idea was also not exactly thought up with reason, rationality, or even great intelligence, if only because the whole thing was not considered more than superficially and illogically. The whole thing has neither been researched nor thought through logically, as is unfortunately the case with the majority of the population, as well as with the majority of the government, researchers, scientists and climate protection commissioners, etc., because they all only see everything superficially and judge it laxly, as they are also not interested in getting to the bottom of the crux of the matter. If we start by looking at the basic factor of electrical energy demand, which on the one hand has been in short supply in all countries of the Earth for many decades, and on the other hand cannot be produced in sufficient and necessary quantities, even with the dangerous nuclear power plants and all kinds of renewable energies, such as wind and water turbines, tidal energy and biogas energy, as well as through geothermal energy generation and solar collectors, etc., then we have to look at the fact that the energy demand of the Earth is not sufficient, cannot be produced in sufficient and necessary quantities to supply the huge mass of the already approximately 9 billion earthly overpopulation with the necessary electrical energy. Then the Foreign energy-saving tip is not only to be judged as ill-considered, but effectively as pathological stupidity and as erroneous. And this is even more the case when one considers that the earthly human population increases by around 100 million more births every year, which also become dependent on electrical energy in various ways. This is in addition to the fact that every year around 100 million human beings also reach adulthood, whereby they legally acquire the right to purchase a car and thus be allowed to drive around as road users. So, more and more cars are being put into operation and put on the roads, which will get steadily worse in the future due to the rampant overpopulation that is also spreading further and further into all rural areas worldwide. Cars can still be run on petrol, gas and diesel oil thanks to the Earth's resources and exploitation. But the Earth's resources are slowly but surely dwindling and will eventually run dry, which is why electric vehicles are now being built and are becoming very popular. However, the fact that this will lead to an ever-increasing demand for electrical energy and that the shortage of electricity will rapidly increase over time, and that ultimately it will no longer be possible to produce enough, is not being considered. In the end, it will be the case that huge areas of land that are still fertile will be converted into energy landscapes, and masses of forests will be cleared and plundered, where only huge solar collector fields and wind turbine areas, as well as geothermal power plants, etc., will be left standing in order to produce more and more electrical energy. This, instead of then using the lands for the ever more immense and precarious food demand, and thus for the increasing food cultivation for the madly and inexorably growing overpopulation. Assessing the energy problem correctly requires a lot more than crooked ideas and energy-saving tips by the grace of stupidity. Because first of all, a distinction must be made between conventional energy sources and renewable energy sources. Conventional in this respect are the basic Earth resources: oil, natural gas, wood and coal, but nuclear fission must also be included, the nuclear fission of atoms, which produces radioactivity and gamma radiation, among other things, as well as various other properties. And on this subject, I think that something probably needs to be explained, although I cannot get involved in nuclear physics because I know next to nothing about it, and can only say a little about it from my general knowledge of nuclear reactors. Nuclear fission as a whole is a plant called a nuclear reactor, as well as an atomic reactor or atomic pile, which serves as a nuclear power plant in which regulated, continuous nuclear fission chain reactions take place on a macroscopic or technical scale visible to the naked eye. This nuclear fission, in turn, is used to generate electrical energy or to produce certain radioactive substances, up to and including the substances needed for atomic bombs. Nuclear fission, as I understand it as a non-physicist, is a special form of nuclear transformation that takes place by bombarding a heavy atomic nucleus with neutrons, which forces it to split into two medium-heavy atomic nuclei, whereby neutrons are also released and give off energy, and this is called nuclear energy. So it can be said, if I understand the whole thing correctly and interpret it correctly, that the whole thing corresponds to nuclear fission in a special form of nuclear transformation, to which I think I can simply understand the whole process as the transformation of atomic nuclei into new nuclei. But it is interesting to know that there were also natural nuclear reactors on Earth, at least in prehistoric times, because at that time there were various natural nuclear reactions, as I learned from Sixteenth in relation to the formation of the Earth. It is also to be explained that many high-tech nuclear power reactors or nuclear reactor plants are widespread and used all over the Earth, which enable the fission of uranium or plutonium, which on the one hand generates a lot of heat, from which electrical energy is then usually generated by energy converters, among other things. But describing this would probably go too far, and I am also a layman in this respect and could only explain a little. What I can say, however, is that in addition to nuclear power plant reactors, so-called research reactors are also used for the production of free neutrons, whereby these are used for material research, but also for the production of certain radioactive nuclides that are used for medical or other functions and projects. I also have to say, and I think this is particularly important, that the populations of all states are being cheated and deceived with regard to nuclear power plants, namely with regard to nuclear reactors, because when the populations are told that a nuclear power plant will be built, this does not usually mean that only one nuclear reactor will be built in one place. The truth is that, as a rule, when such a power plant is built, several nuclear reactors are installed, which means that a single nuclear power plant has several nuclear reactor units equipped with steam generators and turbine sets. Turbine sets are combinations of interconnected rotating machines, or a turbine, and a generator whose shafts are usually connected by a coupling, whereby these machines are necessary for the actual generation of electricity. My meagre knowledge in this respect corresponds to my limited knowledge of power plant technology, which I acquired during a technical discussion with an energy expert. As I recall, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, there was a real nuclear euphoria throughout the world, resulting not only in cries for nuclear power plants everywhere, but also for nuclear-powered road, water and air vehicles, and even rockets and spaceships. This then led to submarines, aircraft carriers, other large ships, cargo ships and icebreakers, as well as space missiles being equipped with nuclear reactor propulsion systems, with the USA, Russia and France being particularly prominent in this respect, followed by practically all other nuclear powers. However, the fact that there were great dangers from the use of nuclear energy from the very beginning was not taken into account and was even mendaciously denied until there were explosions, as in Chernobyl and Fukushima, where supercauses created effective death zones, and where there is also a danger of further supercauses today and in the future. This is because an accident with devastating consequences can happen at any time in any nuclear power plant. Because neither is earthly technology perfect in any way, nor are earthlings able to control it in such a way that something would be absolutely foolproof. The normal operation of nuclear power plants, nuclear waste storage facilities and nuclear waste transports alone poses great dangers, as well as emitting dangerous radioactive radiation that causes cancer in the human beings exposed to it, damages the genetic makeup, and ultimately leads to death. All this in relation to conventional electrical energy or electricity generation by nuclear power plants, whereas energy power plants for electricity generation are almost harmless, such as those that use water power, wind energy, solar energy, biomass, and geothermal energy or geothermal heat. The whole energy problem consists mainly in the fact that today, tomorrow and in the future, two different forms of energy sources will play a major role, whereby, of course, the world's resources in particular must also be called into question, because they will not suffice for much longer as a result of the irresponsible exploitation by overpopulation and its unstoppable further growth. Also, the majority of the growing overpopulation, as a result of its sheer imbecility and roaring irresponsibility, will be followed in the future by a manifold collapse, caused by its growth irresponsibility and commensurate with its criminal actions, which will no longer allow it to prosper. And that the misuse of coal, oil and natural gas, as well as the use of nuclear power for global warming and thus for climate change, will also come into play, even if the whole thing is denied in this respect with regard to nuclear power plants, will be confirmed in a nasty way. If the question is asked as to what will happen in the next 2 to 3 decades with regard to fossil fuels, then even a few logical thoughts reveal facts that are frighteningly related to the worldwide shortage of electricity, which the longer, the less can be remedied. This is because, against all reason and responsibility, the Earth humans continue to carelessly increase their mass of humanity and do not implement a birth stop and birth control for several years, with the result that every newly born Earth human being contributes to the coming and inevitable climate catastrophe from an early age, and does so more and more in the course of his or her life. Primary energy sources are still used to generate electricity, and if we look at the energy mix in relation to global consumption as a whole, calculations show that fossil fuels such as oil, coal, wood and natural gas account for approx. 65%, uranium for operating nuclear power plants for 17%, and renewable energy sources for 18% of global electricity generation. This ratio will be maintained for a long time, also in the next 2 decades, and also when more renewable energy sources are developed and these increase to approx. 22 to 24% worldwide. Overall, it is mainly the consumption of fossil fuels that will continue to rise, and their extraction and refining will become increasingly precarious, as will the production of electricity and vehicle fuels. If everything is considered further along with many other factors that cannot be listed, because they would fill books, then there is no doubt about the fact that the worldwide energy demand for electricity and in the form of vehicle fuels will continue to increase tremendously within the next 2 to 3 decades as a result of rampant overpopulation. Because every newborn Earthling will inevitably be more and more dependent on energy from birth onwards. However, he is already dependent on this in the womb due to various circumstances, which no human being thinks about and consequently does not make any problems about the additional electrical energy demand, which already begins when, after conception, the pregnancy is at least determined and pictorially recorded by ultrasound during the development of the early fetus. And after that, the electrical energy demand increases continuously more and more, depending on how the pregnancy and health, etc., of the mother and the fetus progresses up to birth, after which the ever-increasing electrical energy demand of the growing child and then in adulthood increases continuously more. And if this is considered according to the annual mass of newly born Earthlings, as well as those growing up, then even a halfway normal Earthling who is capable of understanding and reasoning can imagine what will ultimately result in the future in terms of electrical energy demand. Air, atmosphere and environmental pollution, nature, fauna and flora, as well as the destruction of the planet and the impending climate collapse. And it must also be considered and borne in mind that if the fertile land areas for energy production are built up with wind generators and solar collectors, etc., and the food-growing areas are destroyed as a result, hunger will become rampant worldwide, and no longer only in special hunger countries, but everywhere. And when the forests are cleared in order to gain land for the cultivation of potatoes and other food crops, then the greatest catastrophe of Earth humans is approaching, which will be caused by the guilt and criminal machinations of overpopulation, if the madness of the endlessly growing world population is not stopped by stopping and controlling births, With the further rapid increase in overpopulation, there is not only an increase in the demand for electrical energy, as well as food, but also the demand for housing, farm buildings and roads, etc., whereby more and more fertile land is built up and destroyed, and thus the land for growing food becomes increasingly scarce. Through all this, the whole world is being changed in such a destructive way that, due to the indisputable fact of declining economic growth, most developing countries will inexorably work more and more rapidly towards decay and ruin in the next 2 to 3 decades and will eventually fail completely. And the fact that for years there has been an unmistakable worldwide urge on the part of human beings for ever faster education, especially with regard to modern electronic technology and various sciences, does not, contrary to all the lies of statisticians and well-known organizations, have any effect on general declines in birth rates. Because birth rates continue to rise year after year, with the result that the climate is being more and more destructively influenced by the constantly growing human beings. And the fact that the industrialized countries continue to invest more and more in these countries year after year does not change the whole disaster, not even in the sense that huge amounts of these investments disappear into dark channels, and some of the people in power, etc., in these countries enrich themselves with them. On the other hand, large amounts of these investments also find their buyers as bribes, just as aid organizations of all kinds enrich themselves with donations from bona fide, generous and compassionate helpers by collecting, legally secured, 40% of the donations for their own expenses and remuneration for their oh-so-benevolent aid work. Well, the intensification of economic relations between the industrialized countries and the developing countries is also to be looked at and considered, because since there is neither a birth stop nor birth control, there will be about 1 billion more human beings living in them within another decade or in 1.5 decades, making all the world's problems much bigger than they already are today. And it will be inevitable that hundreds of thousands and even millions of human beings from all the developing countries will migrate to the prosperous industrialized countries in the next 2 decades, as well as afterwards, and want to live there, the beginning of which has already been created in the course of the last few years as a result of the intelligent ignorance of the German Chancellor Angela Merkel with her welcome culture. The fact that human beings from larger and richer countries such as Brazil, China, India, Australia and South Korea are moving to Western industrialized countries has also been apparent for a long time, as has the fact that the entrepreneurial business enterprises of the countries mentioned are increasingly not only integrating themselves into the world market, but are also spreading out in the industrialized countries and buying up huge areas in the developing countries and making huge profits with their businesses. This is helping many people in various strata of the population to find work and a better life, although the majority of the population is not getting out of poverty. This corresponds to a process by which certain rulers and business people, etc., of the developing countries come into contact with like-minded people in wealthy industrialized countries and become filthy rich, from which, however, not the peoples of all countries, but only their economic and state leaders, and all other rulers and financial jugglers, etc., make profits and ever greater billions. They can make profits and shovel ever greater sums of billions onto their side. The whole of this has spread enormously quickly throughout the world in the last few decades. But all those in power, all those involved and all those who profit from it have been very careful to keep quiet about it, not to tell the people, and thus not to tell the general public. The truth, moreover, is, which is of course vehemently disputed and denied, and neither recognized nor understood by would-be connoisseurs of the whole state of affairs, that the old view of the world, on the one hand with regard to the modern industrialized countries, and on the other hand with regard to the developing countries, has long since ceased to correspond to the old views and facts. The fact is that the advent of globalization has changed everything, allowing countries such as Brazil, Indonesia, China, South Africa, and India, etc., to explosively increase their annual economic output and flood the world with goods and commodities. And that the whole thing will continue like this in the coming decades is something that people do not want to understand. Although it goes without saying that energy prices are already rising worldwide. And also, despite more energy-saving machines, vehicles, and devices of all kinds, the demand for electrical energy will increase extremely quickly and enormously in every respect. This is not only happening in the industrial sector, but also in the hospitality industry, the national economy, and households, whereby we must also not overlook the greatly increased tourism, which in many ways requires an enormous amount of energy. All this also results in the fact that the worldwide demand for energy is increasing at an ever more horrendous rate. And another fact is also that worldwide there is no more economical use of energy resources, so that every admonition and declaration regarding the need to save energy will go out like a sound and vanish like smoke. Even any improved technology and more efficient use of energy that are introduced have no chance of improving anything. On the contrary, they are used to make things even worse in the old style. The economic growth that is also increasingly taking place in the emerging developing countries has the consequence that a certain prosperity is also rising in these countries and ensures that the same criminally insensitive actions are taken with regard to every unnecessary energy consumption as in the prosperous industrialized countries. And with that, I think I have once again touched on the most important facts that cannot be repeated enough and need to be mentioned over and over again until they perhaps make some earthling or other think for once.
Although I know very well how you always carefully think through and analyze any facts you pick up, you then always amaze me when I hear your conclusions.
Now you amaze me with what you say, although I do not think we need to confer about it. English translation, 716th Contact Part 1, Friday the 8th of March 2019, 1842, HRS. But look at this newspaper picture and what is written about it. What do you think about it? Although I am also interested in when the Europeans actually settled on the American continent, long after the Chinese and then the Vikings had been there. Your father Schwartz said that the Europeans were over there quite early.
By Michael Mannheimer 24.1. 2019. To the picture, USA, the deadly superpower and Title 6, million dead, 40 years of U.S. war crimes. Therefore, the play Aaron explained the following.
Our extensive and detailed annals, which we have also kept since the founding of the United States of America, cover completely all the armed conflicts from the beginning and all the warlike, intelligence, and terrorist activities of the USA in every respect. The original settlement by Europeans took place as early as 1430, when the indigenous peoples, the North American Indians, were still alone on the continent, who were then fought for centuries by European immigrants and their descendants and finally almost exterminated. and this was already the case at that time. When between 1430 and 1500, there were about 72 million human beings living on the North American part of the continent, who repeatedly feuded with each other as a result of territorial claims. The indigenous people were descended from their ancestors, the first human beings, whom you also call primitive human beings. These had emerged naturally from this continent itself, and therefore did not come from somewhere else, as the earth anthropologists, etc., assume and claim, because so far they have no idea and no proof that the original ancestors of the original inhabitants of this continent emerged from the planet in a natural evolutionary way, almost at the same time as all other Earth humans who emerged on all continents. So the original inhabitants of North America did not come 10,000 or 12,000 years ago, etc., from the present continent of Asia via a land connection where the Bering Strait is today. North and South America were explored by Europeans from 1492 onwards, and were also increasingly settled and dominated by them, which of course often led to bloody disputes between them and the indigenous people over land and territories, which often resulted in many deaths among the approximately 72 million human beings, indigenous and European, about which, however, no or only very rarely written records were kept. The whole thing, however, had bad consequences for the old established Indian cultures, because even in early times their territories were partly stolen from them by bloody raids and acts of war. They were also forbidden by the Europeans, who believed in Christianity, to practice their faith in nature through bloody torture or even manslaughter and murder, so that they had to accept the Christian faith of the Europeans through vicious coercion, which allowed Christianity to spread in the country. Furthermore, the Europeans brought with them all kinds of European achievements, which were tremendously alien to the natives, frightened them, and caused them to fight against them. In addition, the indigenous people were extremely susceptible to diseases introduced by the Europeans, which caused particularly contagious diseases to spread among the Indians over a long period of time, resulting in countless deaths. In particular, they were afflicted with syphilis because the indigenous women were raped by many Europeans suffering from syphilis. The diseases introduced by the Europeans also caused plagues and epidemics, which led to the extinction of large parts of the original population in many areas. So the whole thing we were researching took place in connection with the armies long before the American continent was officially designated by treaty as the United States of America by European immigrants. And so it occurred long before the emergence of the multi-state structure, as it did with regard to all effectively worldwide warfare. Also, our annals cover extremely precisely everything concerning Civil War actions of the USA, as well as worldwide underhanded intelligence actions, interferences and conspiracies, etc. This also includes secret and open military incursions and led and sponsored acts of war into foreign territories and states. I also list all victims down to the last individual who have died since the USA came into being as a result of all the actions mentioned. Just as we also meticulously check the population of the Earth down to the last individual and always record the number of the end of the year on the 31st of December at 00.00 HRS. I also do this with regard to various other factors, such as the total number of deaths caused by the above-mentioned U.S.-American machinations, which correspond to nothing other than unscrupulous, degenerate, and often massacre-like Secret Service operations and war crimes, as well as monstrous criminal intrigues and treasonous and terrorist crimes, etc. Our very accurate records prove that unconscionable treason, inhuman war crimes, threats, intrigues, coercion, and slander by the USA against those who trust them and their allies have been the rule since time immemorial and continue to be so to this day. All our findings prove that the USA only enters into familiarities and alliances with other states as a sham in order to deceive. defraud, coerce, or, if necessary, to attack them at gunpoint and to bring them under its rule and exploit them. In our way, it is given that we meticulously record everything and anything in our annals and accumulate certain dates. And so we also do this every year with regard to what you asked about. Consequently, I can give you the accumulation result of the 31st of December 2018, which occurred at midnight. It is to be mentioned with a number of about 743 million human beings killed both in the early USA and in the whole American continent, as well as worldwide by the U.S. Secret Services, U.S. military as well as their terror and treason operations, etc. This in contrast to Russia, through whose like machinations some 369 million human beings have been killed worldwide since its first coming into existence as a state entity up to midnight on the 31st of December 2018. But as far as the 6 million people are concerned who are said to have been killed by war actions of the USA in the last 40 years alone, this number is on the one hand very far underestimated and on the other hand cannot be put into relation to the war deaths which have been at the expense of Russia from time immemorial until today, also of the USSR, etc., because the extremely exaggerated, estimated 130-200 million do not correspond for the most part to war actions with foreign states, but to criminal internal murder actions of criminal dictators, etc.
Thanks, your explanations coincide with your father's, but it was good to hear them because some things I did not remember so well. However, if you do not have to go yet, I have something else that should not be discussed officially.
I am in no hurry now.
Good, thanks. Then the following.